Hi everyone, welcome. So here we're going to explore something that we talk about pretty frequently in a Kundalini practice, and that is finding a comfortable seat. And honestly, I'd say that can be a little easier said than done. And there are a number of options that I want to work through outside of practice time so that you can take some time to explore the practice, or like just to workshop this a little bit and take some time to see what actually does feel comfortable for you, so that then when it comes time to be in your practice, you already know what feels, right and best and good for you, and you can bring in the props that you like to have for your home practice. You can, you know, find that position when I may say come into your comfortable seat. So the first thing that I want to talk about is um, our hip anatomy, and you can even see just here. I started in one seated position, and then my body started saying like, "Well, I actually want to move. I want to sit in a different position." No, that's always an option. You're not um, you're never glued to one seated position for the whole practice, right? But back to our hip anatomy. So our hips are designed as, they're a ball and socket joint. So here's your the ball of your hip up in your pelvis, and then here's your femur, your thigh bone that sits into the socket. And that becomes just like this little hinge and can move in all kinds of different directions. Now, our hips tend to be favored one way or the other, either internally rotated, which you may feel more comfortable in a position like rock pose with your legs tucked underneath you. So this is when our hips are more turned in towards the center line. Or you may favor an externally rotated position. So that is sitting in what's called easy seat, um, with our legs in front of us and our knees splayed outwards. So that's opening up the hips, coming into an external rotation. And we are born with our hips favoring one position over the other, favoring internal rotation or external rotation. So know that what maybe feels right and best and good for me may not feel right and best and good for you. And first of all, that is okay. We are not built the same. I would not expect us to feel comfortable in sitting the same exact way. So, with that in mind, let's explore some options and some home-based props, things that you can bring in to help find your easeful seat. So the first thing is, often if we are doing something like, anything where we would want to have our legs in front of us like this, but maybe say this isn't comfortable for you. Also, when you're first starting a practice, or doing some new activity, there's an adjustment period in the beginning where it can feel uncomfortable. So sitting on the ground for an extended period of time isn't comfortable for a lot of people, and it can be for a number of reasons. So maybe it's, newness to activity, or maybe you have had a history of surgeries on any part of your body that you're like, my body doesn't move that way. Or, there's some life cycle event that's happening that you need to just modify your seated position. So keep all of those things in your register, knowing, you know, all of this is available at any time. And your practice may change day to day, week to week, or year to year as it goes on. So the first thing that we can do and that we'll think about is the angle of our knees in relation to our hips. So what we want to look for is creating some space in the front hip crease. And we can do that a few different ways. We can bring in a couple of blocks and create this elevated seat here. And, you know, sometimes sitting on blocks alone can be uncomfortable. So I like to put a blanket or some kind of cushion on the stack of blocks, and then you can come to sit on them. You can let your knees drop down, and you'll notice that here's my hip point. So you can find just that bony prominence on the front part of your hips, and then take that in relation to where your knees are. And here you can see my hips are clearly higher than my knees. I'm creating a lot of space in the front part of my hips, taking any pinching sensation off of my hip flexors that come and attach right on the front part of my hips. So opening up here, especially if you maybe favor an internal rotated position, if your legs want to be, you know, more, knees want to be more out in front of you, creating extra space in the front hips can be helpful. So here's one option. Now this may feel nice for maybe a seated meditation, or if we're doing some upper body movements and our lower body is grounded, that may feel really nice. What this may be challenging for is anytime we're working with our lower body in a seated position. So if we are to have our legs out, then that's putting a lot of tension on the back of the knees, and may be uncomfortable there. So for that, let's explore coming down onto our seat, maybe just elevating on a blanket height. So bringing our blanket seat here, I'm going to slide these to the side, and we can bring in a bolster, or if you don't have a bolster, you can use a rolled up blanket. You can use a pillow. You can use sometimes also like a foam roller, if you have one at home, can be used in this application. So we'll extend the legs out in front of us, lifting the seat up just enough so that it can help our pelvis to be level. So we're taking any tension out of the low back. And then let's say here that this still is feeling a bit uncomfortable. You can take a bolster and slide it just underneath the knees. So again, you're creating a little bit of slack in the thighs, in the front thighs. Maybe that's taking any tension off of the hip flexors, and certainly the back of the legs, and which in turn takes tension off of our low back. And then from here, we could come into a forward fold, or you know, anything that we are doing with our front body and lower body here. Then let's say we're coming into rock pose. And rock pose is when our legs are tucked underneath us, and just like this. But this in itself can also be uncomfortable, especially if you're just learning this practice. So we can come back to our blocks. You can take 1 or 2 blocks here, to create, we'll create like a saddle for for our seat. And maybe two feels okay. You can check that out and just come to straddle side by side on the blocks and sitting directly on the blocks. The shins are in contact with the ground, tops of the feet are in contact with the ground. Again, checking our hip to knee level. So our hips are here, my knees are obviously here. I have plenty of space here on my front hips, and this feels really comfortable and really stable. Sometimes you may notice if you're sitting on blocks, as I'm just here, like my seat kind of rocks a little bit side to side. So let's say we were going to be doing something where we're rotating our upper body. This may feel a bit unstable. So what I may want to do is take one block out, turn this block so that it is the widest base. I may even add a blanket and sit on that. That widens the seat base a bit, giving me more stability, feeling really grounded. I'm connected with the floor. My seat is connected with the elevated seat that I've given myself. And now I can do any kind of rotation here that feels really stable and really strong. And so that's a couple options there. Now let's say you don't have blanket or you don't have blocks. What could you use? You could use, think of anything that you can stack. So you could use you could roll up a blanket. You could make like a good blanket roll. Even just here, let's take this blanket, a wool blanket or a cotton blanket that tends to hold up better with these kind of positions. So again, just rolling that blanket, creating this space, and then sliding that underneath, giving you something to sit on. And I would just explore, and as you're home and looking around your space, see what do I have that may work here in this application. So what's in your home and what you have access to, and certainly if you have questions, you can always reach out, and I'm happy to help you kind of problem solve how to integrate what you have into building your throne. Now, the last thing we can look at is coming into a seated position, and this is always an option. Let's say you have, none of this stuff, but you do have a chair, and you can always come into any time that we're doing a seated pose. So whether it is for a seated meditation or many of our seated postures where we're moving our upper body, you can come into a chair or a seat. I like to use this ottoman that I often have tucked in the corner because it doesn't have any arms, and it is at a pretty good height starting point for my hip to knee ratio that we've been talking about. Now, as I come and sit, on this seat, what tends to happen, especially if we're using any kind of cushioned or upholstered seat, is we sink down, and you'll notice here's my knee, here's my hip. My knees become slightly higher than my hips. So that's pinching that front hip space. We want to elevate my seat to help my hips be a little bit higher than my knees. So what I'll do is bring in some sturdy blankets to add right into the middle. of the seat, and we can try one. You'll always just try something, see where you're at. That's a little bit better. That's about even. That may feel pretty good for a period of time. What I want to try is see maybe just how one more feels. Add in just that second blanket is just the right amount for my hips to be slightly higher than my knees. My knees can still be directly over my ankles. My feet can be firmly on the ground, and I could really do a whole seated practice from here. This could feel really good, and is an option if you want to go, you know, back and forth between sitting on the floor and sitting in a seat as you're familiarizing yourself and your body is becoming attuned to these practices. That's certainly an option there as well. And maybe lastly, you know, all of this stuff is, you know, if you're noticing that actually sitting on the floor feels really comfortable, and you know, we don't need any of this extra stuff. Sometimes I love to just have a blanket or like a meditation pillow, and you can fold it up, and just sitting on that gives just the right amount for me of cushion that my hips can be slightly higher than my knees. I don't have any tension on my hip flexors. My low back can be long and strong. The bowl of my pelvis is even, so I'm not having any tilting of my pelvis forward or backward as I'm sitting on this blanket, and I can really sit here for an extended period of time, and can also do any of the, you know, leg stuff that we may be doing if our legs are extended, and then also doing any of the upper body stuff. So there's a lot of, you know, creativity, thinking outside of the box that we can bring into our home practice to build our throne, to make our seat comfortable. It's often said that, you know, as we're engaging in these practices, Kundalini practices, we're holding the postures for longer periods of time. That in itself can be uncomfortable. So having a seat that is not distracting us from what we're doing in our movement, in our Kriya practice, is super important. It allows us to go into the movement and not be thinking about how uncomfortable or my hips, like how pinchy my hips feel, or that I'm like feeling this like twinging thing in my back, and it allows us to eliminate all of that noise and go into the practice. So I encourage you to take some time, you know, go through the things that we talked about here, bring in a myriad of props, get creative as you move through your house. See what you have available and what might, you know, be an everyday item that you can use as an assist in your practice. And I would love to hear any thoughts or ideas. What's helpful? What have you come up with? I would love to hear from you and what you have to share, because you also have so much wisdom to share with this community, and together we can learn from one another.